You're listening to the podcast for all of the news, notes, and breakdowns for your Ohio State Buckeyes. This is Sons of the Shoe with Nick Wilson and Spencer German.
Sons of the Shoe is back. It's Spencer German. No Nick Wilson this week, but happy to be here with you as we talk about all things Ohio State. Our last episode focused a lot on the NFL guys, the guys that got drafted in a couple weeks back. This episode, all back to the Ohio State program in its current iteration, its current state down in Columbus. And we got plenty of things to talk about with the transfer portal window officially closing for the spring. Guys that are out there. We know some names have obviously left Ohio State's program, not a ton. We haven't heard them linked to an offensive lineman. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What does it mean for the quarterback situation? What does it mean for that room in general? I have some thoughts on that. And I do want to talk about a little bit later in the show, Tim Walton, defensive backs coach, being on an absolute tear right now. And how excited I am about that. So we'll get into all those things coming up, guys, but I do want to remind you to like, subscribe, follow, whatever you want to call it, the podcast. We're still a relatively new podcast. I think we can say that until we've maybe been a podcast and been a thing for over a year. We're not quite there yet. We'll be there this fall. But find us, follow us, like us, subscribe to us, wherever you get your podcast, Odyssey app. Obviously, Apple Podcasts is the one we really want to push your way, so please find us there. You can also follow us at the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel and comment and jump on in and share your thoughts on things and some of the subject matter that we talk about on the show. And we do our best to try to respond to you guys and chime in with you there. Guys, it is May, and it feels like football is right around the corner. I don't know about you, but once the calendar turns to May, I start getting that itch. We haven't had football in a while. Yeah, the NFL draft tries to kind of hold us over for a little bit of time, but it's not actual tangible football games. But once you get to May, man, like you can see it on the horizon. June's coming, July's coming, camps start up, training camp starts in the NFL, and then August rolls around. You got training camps galore. You got college football right there in front of you, a couple weeks out. I can't wait. We're getting closer, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So excited about the time of year we're in, and there's plenty of buzz surrounding, of course, this Ohio State program as they continue progressing and working their way towards the 2024 season with championship aspirations. And with that in mind, I wanted to start with the fact that, as tends to happen this time of year in May, you get people putting out their college football rankings, their preseason or way too early, whatever they want to call them, preseason rankings. And Ohio State, on two notable ones, has come in as the number one ranked team. Ari Wasserman of The Athletic, formerly of Cleveland.com, which I'm very familiar with being a Cleveland, Ohio resident. But he had Ohio State as the number one team in the country. You also had Joel Klatt putting out his top 10 in terms of the programs in the country. And he had Ohio State number one, with Georgia coming in second behind them, which I think is probably the likely or the expectation in terms of what most of the rankings when we get to the preseason and the actual rankings come out are going to look like. And a lot of, Georgia's going to have a very talented roster. The recruiting classes these last couple of years have been top 5 every single year. So they have talent coming in, but they did lose a number of pieces. The one thing that I think works in their favor that maybe doesn't work in Ohio State's favor is the fact that they have the returning quarterback. Carson Beck will be back under center for them. And I think that is notable because when you have a incumbent quarterback with you on a team, and a veteran one at that, it usually bodes pretty well for your team having some success. Now, I think where Ohio State has is less worried about that problem is that you get Will Howard, who's a guy who's done it at the highest level, played at the highest level at Kansas State, and it's indoctrinating him into a new program, but not starting from scratch with like this fresh piece of clay that needs to be molded into some sort of great college quarterback. So you feel like you have a pretty good grasp of what he can do, what he will do in this offense, especially with Chip Kelly taking the reins on the with that offensive coordinator position. So yeah, like that's certainly a bonus for Georgia to have, and Beck returning. But I don't think it should begrudge us or make us feel any type of way about Ohio State not being number one in the country. And I don't think I'm assuming that most I'm assuming the preseason rankings will have Ohio State number 1, and now it's just going to kind of follow suit that way, that even other people who put out their college football rankings will have very similar assessments as Joel Klatt, as Ari Wasserman, as others, because of everything that this team did in the transfer portal, all the pieces that they added, the recruiting classes the last couple of years. It speaks to listen. It is going to be hard for anybody to challenge in terms of what Ohio State is built from an entire roster standpoint and say, yeah, they're not the number 1 team in the country. Now the question is, they have to go out and prove it. Being ranked preseason number 1 is one thing. Being ranked preseason in Joe Schmo's, a preseason ranking for Buckeyes.com. That's not fair because Buckeyes.com is the actual website, but you get what I'm saying. Some made up website from their mom's basement is one thing. Everybody consensusly is going to feel that way because Ohio State has done such a great job this offseason in constructing a championship caliber roster. But the question really becomes, do you want Ohio State to have a little bit of that added pressure on them of being the number 1 team in the country? And the reason I asked that question, I mentioned being a Cleveland native or a Cleveland resident, and being someone who talks about the Browns, covers the Browns, follows the Browns every single season. I have subscribed to this take with the Browns, and I'm telling you right now, like it's totally like a set myself up to be maybe excited rather than disappointed, if that makes sense. Like set myself up to be surprised. Maybe that's a better way to put it than disappointed type of mentality. And I embrace that and I accept that wholeheartedly. What I do is with the Browns, I sit there and I say, listen, I'm just going to give them like a modest 10-7 record and say, yeah, they might make the playoffs, but they could be in the wild card hunt and whatever, and we'll see. That way, if they do better than that, or I'll even say maybe they're going to be 9-8 and miss the playoffs, so that if they go out and they perform at a high level, and to be clear, I do this with all my teams. Throw one of my favorite teams in my face, I'll tell you I do this with all my teams. So it's not just a Browns thing. It's just my mentality on things when it comes to my teams generally. I don't want them in the spotlight. I don't want people talking about them as they're the next great thing. And I use the Browns as an example of that because it has felt like in the last 6 to 7 years with the Browns, after they drafted Baker Mayfield in 2018, it felt like there was all this momentum over the Browns. Everybody was picking the Browns, and they ended up falling on their face more often than not in those seasons. After making the playoffs in 1 year in 2020, they fell back a couple steps, took them till this past season to get back to the playoffs. So I temper my expectations all the time with my teams. It's a sad fan practice of mine. I admit that, but it's what I do. It's what I do. I set myself out to be surprised rather than disappointed. And I don't like my teams necessarily being talked about in the national media narratives and people just heaping praise on them and all these different things. Now, the reason I bring that up is because with Ohio State, it's different. With Ohio State, I expect every year for them to be in that conversation, so much so that if they're not in that conversation, then I'm disappointed. Then I'm like, what's happening that Ohio State isn't in the number 1 team in the country conversation, the national championship conversation? So I have a completely different mentality when it comes to the Buckeyes than I do with most of my other teams in my life, because I want Ohio State. In college football, if you're not in that elite conversation, you're already going into the season assuming that you have no shot. And that's not where any of us ever want to see Ohio State be. So I'm actually, and I understand, being number 1 in the country adds an extra level of pressure, right? Because you got the target on your back. There's nobody ahead of you that anyone's trying to chase or jump. You're going to get every team's best effort when you are dubbed number 1 team in the country. And right now, all these rankings, Joel Klatt, Ari Wasserman, Plumber Joe in his mom's basement, whatever, Buckeyes fan 69 in his mom's basement, their rankings aren't the official rankings. So I understand this is one thing, but that conversation is only going to continue once the official rankings come out. And I'm assuming Ohio State's going to be number 1. And so I'm expecting that. And so they're going to have that added pressure. And in a season where Ryan Day has a lot of pressure on him to finally deliver against Michigan, maybe even finally deliver on a championship that he was trying to kind of pick up where Urban Meyer left off and go be in that championship conversation every year and actually win some championships, he's got a lot to prove. So adding pressure into that pot doesn't necessarily sound all that appealing because you don't want to be this pressure cooker that then blows up in their face or, the moment's too big for somebody. But I with Ohio State, like, I expect it, I want it, and I embrace it because that's the state of this program. Like, that's where this program is supposed to be. This is the direction that they are supposed to be headed on every single year. And if they're not, then we all get a little bit worried about what it means for this team. So, yeah, I take a different approach with Ohio State than I do with my other teams in my life, like I said. And I'm embracing the fact that they're going to go into the season number one. And frankly, they should go into the season number one, given what they've built and the roster that they've assembled. I don't see how anybody other than Georgia even really comes close to that. I think maybe Florida State has a case, although they're going to have a different quarterback under center. There's certainly there are from top to bottom, like, there's not a roster in the country that is more put together and complete and deep, as not at every position, but as deep and talented as Ohio State's roster is. And so, yeah, number one is probably going to be a given. And I'm not so worried about that being the case and having that target on your back because, listen, when you're at Ohio State, you know what the expectations are. And that's the other thing, too. Like, when you have you have a target on your back as the number one team in the country. I think Ohio State is a target on their back no matter what. Doesn't matter. They're Ohio State. They're one of the biggest brands in the country. Fans like you, me, Nick, others, let's face it, guys, we are very culty. College football fan bases in general are very culty. Now, there's levels to the cultianness of these fan bases. Like, we're not doing weird voodoo marching army parade type stuff like Texas A&M does at Ohio State, and that's nice to know because that seems a little over the top and kind of creepy every time I see those videos. But we are still very culty in the way that we support our team and, die on a hill for them at every waking moment and every turn. So, and listen, I embrace it. I don't care. I'm an Ohio State fan. You guys as Ohio State fans, we all embrace that idea that our team is the best and nobody comes close and the whole 9 yards. So fine. I can live with that. But we're obnoxious to a lot of the people outside of the Ohio State fan base, outside of the Ohio State zeitgeist, outside of Ohio in general. We're considered obnoxious. So I do think, like, no matter what, Ohio State is going into a season with that pressure anyway. And Ryan Day talks about that all the time, what it takes to win at Ohio State, what it means to be at Ohio State and win at Ohio State and perform at Ohio State, and that there's constant pressure on him, constant pressure on the program, constant pressure on the quarterback position. Like, they are held in a standard above everybody else. There's the haves and the have-nots in this sport, and then there's the programs that are like the elite level brand that everybody knows, and Ohio State is one of those teams. It's Ohio State, it's Bama, it's Clemson on some level because they're still living off the fumes of several years back when they were in the championship conversation year after year with Trevor Lawrence and that crew. There's Georgia. There is, and there's some other ones that live in that world where they know that they're always good. They're considered a step above everybody, and everybody else is always chasing them. And sometimes those teams slip up a little bit, and other teams creep in, like a Michigan this past year, to take the crown. So, listen, pressure is pressure. I'm not as worried about if everyone's going to dub Ohio State the number one team in the country, including the official rankings when those come out this summer. I can live with it in this instance, even though it maybe goes against what I do with some of my other teams, because that's the one team I've come to expect that from. Like Ohio State, every year I expect these types of expectations, this type of I expect there to be this type of hype. I expect there to be this type of expectations on them. It comes with the territory of being the Ohio State Buckeyes. So I'm not getting scared away by people putting out there that the Ohio State's the number one team in the country. I think it's probably fair and reasonable, given everything that they've assembled this offseason through the transfer portal, through recruiting, and otherwise. I mean, this team is a juggernaut. We've talked about it on this podcast over and over and over again. We even threw out the question at one point, championship or bust. I don't know if I can say wholeheartedly like a season has to. I know we like to do that as Ohio State fans, like it should be championship or bust. But listen, if this team gets to the championship game but they lose, I'm not going to sit here and say fire everybody. Like that's a very good season, and it meets to me the Ohio State standard of being and competing for championships. But yeah, like when you're asking questions like that during a preseason, I expect nothing less than Ohio State to be number one, even if there's added pressure that maybe comes with that right to be the number one team in the country. How do you guys feel about it, though? Should Ohio State be number one in the country? Does it make you nervous at all to add a little extra pressure to the pot here, knowing that now if you go into the season as the number one team in the country, which I'm expecting, again, none of these rankings are official, but the official one comes out and Ohio State is number one. Do you feel are you good with adding a little extra pressure to the pot, knowing that Ohio State's going to get everybody's best shot? I think it just kind of comes with the territory anyway, and you just got to kind of expect that when you're Ohio State, you're going to get everybody's best shot regardless. But what do you think? Let us know via the YouTube comments of the 92 Through the Fan YouTube page. When we get back, guys, Tim Walton is on an absolute tear for Ohio State through the recruiting trail. We'll recap some of the big talents that he's recruiting and guys that are potentially coming to Ohio State. I say potentially because, commitments at this point can be very fluid things, and what it means for restoring the program to a title that I feel like has escaped them in recent years. All that and more on Sons of the Shoe. But quick, here's a word from our sponsors.